The voice in the dark. Josh had always been skeptical about the supernatural, but that was before the incident. It happened on a cold winter's night, one where the wind howled and the trees seemed to groan under the weight of the snow. Josh was alone in his cabin deep in the woods, a place he had retreated to for a weekend of solitude. The cabin was old, but sturdy, with thick walls that had seen many winters. The only light came from the fire burning in the hearth, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. Josh was enjoying the quiet, the isolation, until he heard it. The sound of a voice, faint but clear, calling his name. At first, he thought it was the wind, a trick of his imagination. But then he heard it again, closer this time, as if someone was right outside his door. He stood up, his heart pounding, and walked to the window. There was nothing but darkness outside, no sign of life. "Josh!" The voice was clearer now, almost inside his head. It was a woman's voice, soft and sad, filled with a longing that sent shivers down his spine. He backed away from the window, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The voice continued, relentless, calling his name over and over. It was as if the walls themselves were whispering to him, pressing in on him, suffocating him. He tried to block it out, to focus on something else, but it was no use. The voice was everywhere, surrounding him, consuming him. In a desperate attempt to escape, he ran to the door, flinging it open. The cold air hit him like a slap in the face, but the voice was still there, following him into the night. He stumbled through the snow, his feet sinking into the deep drifts, but he couldn't outrun it. The voice grew louder, more insistent, until it was all he could hear. It was driving him mad, tearing at his sanity. He fell to his knees, clutching his head, screaming for it to stop. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it was gone. Josh was left alone in the silence, the cold biting into his skin. He staggered back to the cabin, his mind reeling. He didn't sleep that night, too afraid of what might happen if he closed his eyes. The voice didn't return, but the fear it had instilled in him never left. Years later, Josh still couldn't explain what had happened that night. He had moved away from the cabin, unable to bear the memories it held. But sometimes, late at night, he would hear that voice again, calling his name from the darkness, and he would remember the terror he had felt, knowing that something was out there, something that wanted him. The Collector. In the small town of Marlow, there was a legend about a man known only as the Collector. He was said to be a recluse, living on the outskirts of town in a dilapidated old house filled with strange and unsettling artifacts. People whispered about the things he collected, things that should not exist, things that defied explanation. Lily had always been curious about the Collector. She was a journalist, always on the lookout for a good story, and the mystery surrounding him was too intriguing to ignore. One day, she decided to visit his house, despite the warnings from the townspeople. The house was exactly as she had imagined, dark, foreboding, with an air of decay. The front door creaked as she pushed it open, stepping into the gloom. The air was thick with dust and the scent of something rotten. Lily shivered but pressed on, her curiosity outweighing her fear. The inside of the house was even more disturbing than she had expected. Every surface was covered in strange objects, ancient masks, twisted sculptures, jars filled with murky liquids. But what caught her attention were the paintings. Dozens of them lined the walls, each one depicting a different scene of horror, monsters, twisted bodies, scenes of unimaginable suffering. But it was the faces in the paintings that chilled her the most. They were so lifelike, so real, as if the people in them were trapped, frozen in their final moments of terror. And then she realized they were real. The paintings weren't just depictions of horror. They were the final moments of real people, captured and preserved forever. A noise behind her made Lily spin around. There, standing in the doorway, was the Collector. He was tall and gaunt, with eyes that seemed to bore into her soul. "Do you like my collection?" he asked, his voice cold and emotionless. Lily couldn't speak, couldn't move. She was paralyzed with fear as the Collector walked towards her, his eyes never leaving hers. I see you've taken an interest in my work, he said, his voice dripping with malice. Would you like to become part of it? With a wave of his hand, the room began to spin. Lily felt herself being pulled towards one of the paintings, her body growing cold, her vision blurring. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it was over. Lily found herself standing in the middle of the room, but everything was different. The colors were muted. The air was thick and oppressive. She looked down at her hands and realized they weren't her hands anymore. She was part of the painting now, trapped in a world of darkness and despair, forever a part of the collector's macabre gallery. The stalker. Emily had always felt safe in her small apartment. It was cozy, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, and she liked the anonymity it offered. But that sense of security was shattered the day she found the first note. It was a simple piece of paper, slipped under her door while she was out. The message was brief, just a few words scrawled in a shaky hand. I'm watching you. Emily tried to brush it off as a prank, something harmless. But then the notes started coming more frequently, each one more disturbing than the last. I know where you live. I see you when you sleep. I'm closer than you think. She went to the police, but there wasn't much they could do. The notes didn't contain any threats, just vague statements that hinted at something darker. Emily started to feel paranoid, constantly looking over her shoulder, checking her windows and doors multiple times a night. Then, one evening, she came home to find her apartment door slightly ajar. Her heart raced as she pushed it open, half expecting to find someone inside. But the apartment was empty, everything in its place, except for a single photograph on her kitchen table. It was a picture of her, taken from outside her window while she was sleeping. Emily's hands trembled as she called the police again, but they found no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, nothing. It was as if the stalker had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only fear. But Emily knew he was still out there, watching her. She could feel his eyes on her whenever she stepped outside, could sense his presence in the shadows. She started to hear things at night, footsteps in the hallway, the creak of floorboards that weren't hers. The final straw came when she woke up one night to find a man standing at the foot of her bed, his face obscured by darkness. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching her. Emily's scream caught in her throat as she reached for her phone, but by the time she turned on the light, he was gone. Emily couldn't take it anymore. She packed up her things and moved out the next day, leaving behind everything she owned. But even in her new apartment, in a different city, the fear followed her. Every creak, every shadow, every stranger on the street reminded her of the stalker who had invaded her life. And every night, as she lay in bed, she would see his figure in the darkness, standing at the foot of her bed, watching, waiting. The Black Forest. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway, a camping trip in the Black Forest with her friends. Lisa had always loved the outdoors, and the idea of spending a few days in the wilderness, away from the hustle and bustle of city life, was appealing. The first night was perfect. They set up camp near a small stream, roasted marshmallows over the fire, and told ghost stories late into the night. But the next morning, things started to go wrong. They woke up to find that one of their friends, Mark, was missing. His tent was empty, his belongings untouched. At first, they thought he had gone for an early morning hike, but as the hours passed and he didn't return, worry began to set in. They searched the surrounding area, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. The forest was eerily quiet, the trees seeming to close in around them. Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something was out there, lurking just beyond their sight. As night fell, the fear among the group grew. They huddled around the fire, their eyes darting to the shadows, listening for any sound that might indicate Mark's return. But the only thing they heard was the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional snap of a twig. Then, just as they were about to give up and call for help, Mark stumbled into the clearing. He was disheveled, his clothes torn, and his eyes wild with fear. He tried to speak, but his voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "We have to leave," he managed to say, his hands trembling. "It's not safe here." The group crowded around him, bombarding him with questions, but Mark wouldn't, or couldn't, explain what had happened. He just kept repeating that they needed to leave, that they weren't alone in the forest. Lisa felt a chill run down her spine as she looked into Mark's eyes. There was something off about him, something that made her uneasy, but she didn't have time to dwell on it, because at that moment, a low, guttural sound echoed through the trees. A sound that didn't belong to any animal she had ever heard. Panic set in as the group quickly packed up their things, abandoning the campfire and tents. They stumbled through the darkness, the trees seeming to reach out and grab at them as they hurried along the narrow path. The strange sound followed them, growing louder, closer. Mark was leading the way, moving with a frantic urgency that drove the rest of them forward. But as they reached a fork in the path, he suddenly stopped, his body rigid. "No," he whispered, his voice filled with terror. "This is where it got me." Before anyone could react, a shadowy figure emerged from the trees, moving with unnatural speed. It was tall, its form barely visible in the darkness, but its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. The group froze in place, paralyzed by fear. Lisa felt something cold and slimy wrap around her ankle, and she screamed, trying to pull away. But it was no use. The thing in the darkness had her, dragging her towards the shadowy figure. Her friends tried to help, but they were too scared to move, their eyes wide with horror. In a last-ditch effort, Lisa grabbed a nearby branch and swung it at the figure, but her arm passed through it as if it were made of smoke. The thing let out a bone-chilling hiss, and Lisa felt her strength fading, her vision blurring as she was pulled further into the darkness. And then, everything went black. When Lisa awoke, she was alone. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Her friends were gone, their tents and belongings scattered around her. There was no sign of the shadowy figure, no sign of what had happened the night before. But deep down, Lisa knew the truth. The Black Forest had claimed them, taken them into its dark, twisted embrace. And she knew, as she stumbled out of the forest, that it would never let them go. Lisa never returned to the Black Forest, and she never spoke of what had happened to anyone. But the memory of that night haunted her, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked just beyond the edge of the light, waiting, watching.